also the president of the Open Hardware Board. The Open Hardware Board has recently released new certifications, and we need to be aware of this.
Yes, Maria, you have our undivided attention.
Hey, everybody, come on.
To believe. You need to be very aware of what is happening in the open hardware movement. I know that the e-NABLE Alliance and the e-NABLE community often think of themselves as people who use open source. People who may think of themselves as practicing research that allows us to collect open data or to practice open science. But you need to understand that we are also viewed by the open hardware community, and some of the solutions that are being developed are open hardware solutions. Please understand this community because you are living in it. And what they're doing right now is also visionary. And so I would very much like you to understand the structure of the open hardware movement and the certifications they've released. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Maybe?
There we go. Try again.
How about now?
Now.
Yes, maybe? All right.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. Thank you for bringing me into this great group. I love the work that you are all doing, and so I'm excited to be able to touch base with you. I think what would be helpful is to give you a sense of kind of what's happening in the open hardware movement. And Maria especially asked me to talk a little bit about licensing stuff. And then I'm happy to try and answer questions that you might have. So as a quick background, for those of you who don't know, the Open Source Hardware Association, or OSHWA, is an organization that was formed almost 10 years ago now. And the purpose of OSHWA was to bring together the open hardware community, which is a huge community that has a number of subsets, including people like you, who are doing open hardware. And so the first thing that OSHWA did was help develop a community definition of open source hardware to kind of get everyone on the same page. And then we also hold the Open Hardware Summit, the big gathering of people interested in open source hardware every year. The next summit is up in New York in March. And if you're interested, I very much encourage you to come on up. It's my favorite event of the year. A thing that OSHWA has done in more recent years is developed an open source hardware certification program. And the reason the certification program exists essentially is because no one owns the term open source hardware. And so we found that there was a lot of confusion in the community when people were saying, oh, I'm doing this thing, it's open source hardware. And the creator's definition of open source hardware was different than the user definition of open source hardware. And so there could be a kind of mismatch of expectations. And so what the certification program does, the certification program is free, is it allows people to get certified as complying with the community definition of open source hardware and use a special logo that means that they can say, when I say open source hardware, I mean this definition. And if you're thinking about using open source hardware, and you see that logo, you know what definition they're talking about. So if you're interested in all this, there's a certification page, certification.oshwa.org. I'll let you check it out. One of the side effects of the certification program is that it is starting to help kind of standardize elements of open source hardware documentation to make sure that people are including everything in their documentation that would allow someone outside of their immediate community to be able to understand and use the hardware. And one of the things that's come out of that has been this sort of licensing process, this licensing standardization. And I'm not going to pretend that we're at a place where we've standardized licensing, but we are slowly and surely moving in that direction. The thing to understand about open source hardware licensing in contrast to open source software licensing is it's a little bit more complicated, essentially. Software is born closed, right? It's automatically, the moment it's written, it wrapped up in copyright protection. And so you are a creator of software and you want to share it with people, you need to take affirmative steps to invite people to share it, which is to use an open software license. That I give you formal legal permission to build upon the software, to copy the software. And if I... Hello?
Hi. Rough landing. Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So I don't know quite where I dropped off, but as I was saying, open software is sort of born closed, and so you need to do licensing to let people use it. Hardware is born open, which means that by default, in a lot of ways, people are already free to build upon it. And so what that means, on some level, is if you're doing an open hardware project, you don't need to worry as much about licensing, because in a lot of ways, you don't have a legal right to control other users. But licensing can still be really important because there might be kind of small hidden things that you do have rights to that could get in the way of someone who wanted to build upon the hardware or to contribute to the project. And also, kind of equally the licensing serves as a signal to people who want to use the hardware in ways that like the creators want. And so when you think about open source software licenses, in a lot of ways, those licenses are about controlling bad actors. When you're thinking about open source hardware licensing, what you're really thinking about is creating signage and guideposts for good actors who want to do what you as a creator want with the things that you're making. And so the last point that I'll make is that when you're thinking about, another thing that makes hardware more complicated is there are more pieces. And so when you're thinking about licensing your hardware, you need to think about some different components. You need to think about them separately. You need to think about the hardware itself and how you're licensing the hardware. The software, if there is any, how you're licensing the software. The documentation for the hardware as a separate entity, and then also any trademarks or other marks you have for the hardware itself. If you go to the certification page, if you go to certification.oshwa.org, in addition to being able to do the certification, there are some resources that walk through each of those different steps, those different elements, and explain how to think about how different rights apply to them. Also, if you don't really want to spend a lot of time thinking about it, they show you the choices that things that have already been registered, that projects that have already been registered have made, and you can actually just look at the registry. And so if you're like, I don't want to really think about this, you can find a project that you trust and follow the path that they've already taken. So it's sort of like a quick intro to all of this stuff. I'm happy to talk more about any of it or to answer questions, whatever is helpful.
Does anyone have any questions so far about what we talked about?
My question would be, do you have a case in point, a case study you can share with us about how this process has worked?
So John Schultz's question is, do you have a case study for how this process has worked?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we've got hundreds of case studies on the site, both in the registry to be able to find it, and all the education materials are done in the context of a case study. So there's a huge number of them. If for example, you were creating a prosthetic hand, and you were trying to think it through, so the first thing you would think of is, so there's no software, so we don't have to worry about the software. For the hardware, for the hand itself, it's unlikely that the creators of the hands have any copyright interest in the hand. The hand probably is not protected by copyright. And so the license on the hardware itself probably wouldn't allow you to control other people. What does it mean to control other people? You think about a kind of classic copyleft license that says you can use this software as long as the changes that you make are also open, or like a CC share alike kind of license. A license like that on hardware of the hand is probably not enforceable, which means that somebody could make a modification, not make it open, and you would not have a legal right to go after them. But it still can be useful as a signal to people to say, hey, we're using this license that may not be enforceable, but if you are a good actor and you want to follow the wishes of the community that's created this, you should think about contributing back in. The next layer there is going to be the documentation itself, so kind of like separate and distinct from the hand itself is all the documentation, all the files. Thinking about sharing those under a Creative Commons license so people can remix and build upon that documentation is really important. And then, and I know that this is a kind of a point of contention, or I believe I know that this is a point of contention in the community, but thinking about the name itself. And if there's a party or there's somebody who has control over the use of a specific name for the project, that's something that they usually don't want to openly license. Because that's something that, like it shows the source of a hand.
Could we discuss a case that I could, John? This is Maria. Michael, would that be all right?
Yeah, sure.
So there was a young man outside of the United States who created his own lab and was using the e-NABLE designs to launch his lab and his reputation. In some cases, he was selling the hands and arms. In other cases, he was giving them away. Sometimes he would innovate on the open source design, and then he would claim the open source design without giving credit to the people who had created the design it was based on. So I was asked to go to the embassy of this country to speak with the science attaché while I was in London, and they asked me to bring designs and a timeline in order to defend the intellectual property of the open source intellectual property of the designers of this community. So when I produced the designs and compared them to the images that they had, it stopped our conversation. The science attaché basically, she pushed back the chair and she said, oh wow, they're really a lot alike. And so she just asked me, what did we want to do next? Because this young person was receiving a portion of a sale of an item that summer. And so I didn't ask for the money, and I didn't ask for us to do anything. To be perfectly honest, what I said is I don't want us to do anything weird. I didn't want to crash the person who had joined our community a couple of years before, and so I asked that they recognize the owners of the intellectual property that their design was based on, so that all of the votes would go up, because that was the appropriate application of that license. And what I asked was instead that they join us in a project so that they made and gave away the hands appropriately, because that was the condition under which the designs had been shared. We created a platform, an Algorand, using blockchain to create an immutable timeline, so that there was another point of reference that could not be changed by any of the parties, so that we were able to use that immutable timeline to maintain our stand on when the designs have been created and shared. And that's what we've been using since then. Do you have any comments or response on that?
Yeah, so let me preface all this by saying that I am not your lawyer, so this is not legal advice, and so I'm going to abstract it up a step or two. There are details about this that will matter that I don't want to talk about because I don't want to give you legal advice.
I gotcha, no problem.
With that qualification, I think it's maybe really helpful to think about this on two related but separate tracks. There's a legal track and there's a community track. And so from a community standpoint, there is an expectation within the community, like you said, that people at a minimum, give credit back to the project. And that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about good actors, right? Someone who wants to follow the community rules, it's really important to make those rules clear. So if someone wants to follow the rules, it's easy for them to do so. And to really encourage them to do it. And if they don't, in some cases it is appropriate to use what I would think of as community sanctions, right? To like point out that this person is violating the community rules and the community expectations by using the design and not giving credit. That is completely separate from the legal ability to force someone to do something. And in most cases with a functional object like a prosthetic hand, there is no intellectual property rights. There are no intellectual property rights in the hand. And so you probably don't have a legal right to force someone to comply with the community rules if they don't want to. So it's important to be really clear-eyed about that, because whatever, like a timeline is helpful in the sense that you might want to use it to enforce the community norm, sort of socially, but it's not necessarily going to be particularly legally relevant because there's no legal barrier to someone just taking the design and doing whatever they want with it.
So there are other forms of open hardware that are being developed by members of this community. There are people who have been working on solar power. There are people who are working on using the 3D printing and the skills learned in e-NABLE projects to develop other things that are needed. At New Hope Hospital in Haiti, they created a sterilization. All right, so there are some forms of open hardware that are being used in the community. Open hardware applies to more than the hands. It applies to the jigs that you were creating, the jigs that were shared. It applies to the tools that are being developed in the Within Reach collection. It applies to the people who are using the workforce skills and techniques that they are learning and teaching people through the service learning and e-NABLE, and those projects that are being carried forward, like e-NABLE Enlightens in Sierra Leone. That's a solar-powered project. Okay, all right. It applies to the people who are learning how to grind up waste plastic and extrude new filament. That extrusion process and the tools being used to monitor and test and spool are all things that are part of the open hardware movement. So there are probably a dozen things that you have touched in the past year that this all applies to. So thinking on that, does anyone else have any other questions? Because I also want you to realize that Louisa and some of the others that are working on sensors and haptic feedback, they're in this realm. And that's very important. People who are developing new joints and new robotics, who are working on arms. Things like what you're doing, Skip, that are so wonderful. Even if they are 5 paper clips, I think this is outstanding work, and this is part of what we're working on here. So do we all understand how this fits into our ecosystem? Super, okay. Time check, please. All right, so Michael, I'm going to give you final words here. Thank you so much for this odyssey. We had quite a number of sound effects to go with it. Here you go.
Is he speaking?
Michael, I'm turning it back over to you for the closing remarks for this.
Is he speaking?
Our students and IT are still figuring out the sound here. That's okay. Can you give us a count, Doug? Are you still there?
Still here.
Maria, if you,
All right. We're going to close this session now before we all lose our hearing. The next up on deck are the people who are coming to us from George Mason University. I'm grateful to see you in the room. We're going to kill the sound, gentlemen. Are you ready? Okay, let's close the sound. Michael, thank you very, very much.